a good time to go ahead and get started. As you get settled into your Zoom chairs, I would just like to go over a couple housekeeping items. First, please be sure to stay muted for the entire presentation. And if you get any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type those into our chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the entire presentation, and then we'll share those questions with our speaker at the time that we've allotted at the end of our speaker's presentation. We will be recording this presentation, so please act accordingly. And for your best viewing experience, you can go to the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen and make sure that you are in presenter view and not the gallery view. Now, welcome and thank you for joining us for our April 1st Tuesday. My name is Daniel Senner, and I am the Community Conservation Coordinator for the Methow Conservancy. I would like to start off the evening with a few acknowledgements and a thank you. First, I would like to acknowledge that the Methow Conservancy, as a land trust and environmental education organization, we seek to protect and steward the land that for literally thousands of years was cared for by members of the Methow and Okanagan tribes. This is their homeland. We recognize we must do more to build better relationships and acknowledge our past with our Methow and Okanagan tribe descendants who still live and care for the land in this valley. Our speaker tonight would like us to acknowledge that he lives and works in Fort Collins, Colorado, and that is the ancestral homeland of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. As conservationists and scientists, we acknowledge the reality that enjoying the outdoors is a privilege, and that not all people have equal access to or feel welcome in the amazing places that we work to protect. Finally, I would like to thank local Becca Wendell for recommending and securing tonight's speaker. Now, it is no secret that our valley is growing rapidly. With new visitors and residents alike, as we grow, we must be increasingly aware of our actions and how they impact the wildlife that make this place so special. The size of our community is at a tipping point, and we need to be proactive if we want to avoid falling into the same traps that have eroded so many other special places. One of those traps that has plagued many communities is garbage. When improperly stored and secured, our ordinary household garbage bins become lethal attractions for local black bears. As omnivores, black bears will eat just about anything with caloric value, and their extremely powerful noses attract them to our trash with the promise of an easy meal. What makes this lethal is that our garbage is such a good source of calories that once a bear has tasted human food, it remembers the location of that food for its entire life. Even if that bear is relocated to another area, it will find its way back to that food over and over. Thus, the bear becomes a problem bear. Wildlife managers then are only left with lethal removal as the tool for dealing with problem bears. But as a community, we can work together to prevent bear exposure to trash in the first place. Thankfully, we live in a proactive place, and last year a coalition between WasteWise Methow, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, private partners, defenders of wildlife, and the Methow Conservancy formed out of a shared recognition of the growing human black bear conflict in the Methow Valley and a desire to do something about it. A first step out of this working group was the purchase of 25 bear-proof trash cans by the Methow Conservancy and Defenders of Wildlife to go to high conflict areas in the Methow Valley. Those cans are currently out in the wild and doing good work, but they are not enough to solve the problem. That's why tonight this working group is launching a new initiative. It's called Methow Bear Aware. Led by the Methow Conservancy, this fundraising and awareness campaign is aimed at providing the necessary resources to Wastewise Methow to transition key areas to bear-proof trash cans and create educational opportunities aimed at fostering a long-term bear-friendly community. Over this spring, summer, and fall, you can expect to see events, resources, and stories under the banner of Methow Bear Aware. I encourage all of you to participate and share these efforts with anyone who cares for the Methow Valley. I know some of you may be feeling just a little bit bitter towards bears after Gonzaga's defeat to the Baylor Bears in the NCAA finals last night. But as we speak, our bears are waking up hungry from their winter torpor. And so the time to act is now. These are 3 things that you can do this week to help save our local black bears and this special place. The first thing you can do is if you live in an area where you often see black bears or had a black bear trash incident, please store your garbage in a garage or shed until the morning of trash pickup. Take down your bird feeders. Now is the time. And you can also email Casey Bouchard, the general manager at Wastewise Methow. His email is now in the chat box, to get on the waiting list for a bear-proof trash can service. This list is a waiting list for Wastewise customers who are interested in upgrading their current service to include a bear-proof trash bin. This service will cost a little bit more, and Casey can answer questions on what that cost increase will be. But as we will hear from our speaker tonight, these bins are highly effective at reducing bear trash interactions. And so that little bit of extra cost will go a long way towards protecting these bears. There are not currently enough bear-proof bins to go around to everyone who might want one. So this is a wait list, but it will ensure that as soon as there are enough cans, that we can get them out on the ground to the highest priority areas as soon as possible. This brings me to the second thing that you can do this week, and that is to help our Methow Bear Aware campaign purchase more bear-proof trash cans and educate our community. We need your support in raising $15,000 to kickstart our campaign by helping us purchase 50 new bear-proof bins and make 500 people more bear aware than they have ever been. For $50, you can be a sponsor for a bear cub to live a trash-free life. Or for $100, you can sponsor a black bear parent to raise a generation of trash-free bears. And thanks to pledges from some very generous donors, every dollar you donate to the Methow Bear Aware campaign is matched up to $7,500. To make a donation for this cause, you can visit the link in the chat box or go to methowconservancy.org/getinvolved/donate. And just be sure with your donation to include Methow Bear Aware in its description. Don't worry, we will send all this information to you in a follow-up email later this week. Now, the final thing you can do tonight is listen. Let the information you receive from this presentation mobilize you to take bear-friendly actions in our community. To guide us tonight in this work is Dr. Stewart Breck. He is a research scientist for USDA's Wildlife Research Center in Fort Collins, Colorado. He specializes in human-carnivore interactions and has experience working with coyotes, polar bears, and of course, black bears. His work is highly relevant to our efforts. And so without further ado, let's welcome Stewart Breck.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. And a shout out to Becca Wendell for inviting me to this. I love talking about bears. I love talking about the work that I've done over the past. And so I'm real excited to be here and to share what I've learned over the past 15 years. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So how's that looking? Can everybody see this?
We can, yep.
Okay, fantastic. So let's get started. And to begin with, this is not a very exciting title. 15 years of black bear research in Colorado focused on human-bear conflict. So I don't know if anybody knows the show Breaking Bad. It was a show about a very smart school teacher who was down on his luck and was trying to make some extra cash for his family and ended up circling into this negative cycle of drugs and money. And it was a fascinating show. And I loved it. So in spirit of that, I'm titling this talk, Black Bears Breaking Bad, because there are a lot of similarities between that show and what we're going to talk about tonight. And so we're going to jump into this. First of all, I just want to say I love my job. I get to work with all kinds of carnivore species, and it's a real pleasure, or it's a cool thing that we don't necessarily talk a lot about, but the recovery of carnivores in the lower 48s in my lifetime has been dramatic. We have grizzly bears, we have wolves, which populations are growing, and we have large populations of black bears. So we should celebrate that, and I think that's an important thing. But with that is definitely some challenges, and this is the new realm of wildlife management, is how do we deal with these challenges? So just a real quick overview. I want to go over some background, and then I'm going to talk about some results from really two different study sites, Aspen and Durango. Most of the talk will be on the Durango study. I think it's probably the most applicable. Actually, both study sites are applicable to what you guys are thinking about. And then, of course, as is typical with me, I want to say some controversial things to see if I can stir the ire of you all and generate some questions. And I do this mostly to play devil's advocate, to push the conversation a little bit. All right, so my work with black bears started, as any good science does, with an observation that made me think, that's kind of strange. And this observation occurred about 20 years ago. I was in Yosemite National Park doing some work for the park. And I was testing out this machine that would alert rangers when bears would get into the campgrounds in the main areas of Yosemite. And I was out with my technician, and at the time when I was working there, bears breaking into cars was a huge problem. It was thousands of cars every summer. And so we're running around, and these bears are so smart, and they know we're coming, and we'd see a bear in one area and we'd chase it off, and they would go running to a different area. And over the course of about a week, my technician and I started to notice something. And we thought, because there's thousands of cars in this parking lot, and they kept breaking into them. We thought, my goodness, I think these bears are actually selecting for certain vehicles. And so, as a good scientist does, we started collecting data. And the graph on your right, with the bear sticking his head out of a car window, basically shows what we found. We thought they were really focusing in on SUVs. What we found was indeed they do break into a lot of SUVs, but they also break into a lot of minivans. Now, the key part of this story is that they break into minivans in a huge disproportion to their availability, meaning those bears are selecting for minivans. So why is that? Well, first of all, anybody who's ever had kids knows how much they're slobs. And if you put a kid in the car, you're going to create all kinds of food garbage in the car. So minivans carrying kids, they make huge messes, and that's what the bears are keying in on. And so what I really learned from this was, wow, these are really smart critters. They're incredibly adapted to finding food. Ripping off car doors is no big deal. Sniffing out the cars that have the food in them is something that bears do. And so I was just fascinated by this. It was like, here's a critter that is going to be incredibly difficult to figure out how do we stop this problem. And so I started looking for other sites where I could really pursue this line of work, this line of research. And Colorado being my home, there was no shortage of bear problems. And so that's how we started the research in Colorado about 15 years ago. And just to give you a little background, this is trends in conflict. So this just shows from like 1986 up to the early 2000s, how conflict has been increasing in the state of Colorado. It includes agricultural issues, urban issues, roadkill, things like that. The point here is that this problem is growing, as it is growing everywhere where there are black bears and there are humans. So we want to think about what are the consequences, and there's consequences for both bears and people. Bears can attack people. It's rare, but it does happen. They certainly can tear up a car or tear up property. And then, of course, we also want to think about what we're doing to the bears. And unfortunately, as Danielle said, oftentimes what we're left with is having to euthanize bears. And this is something that no wildlife manager really wants to do, but sometimes we have to do it. And the question that we're all trying to figure out is, how do we minimize this action? So a little bit of background, kind of give you a little bit more background in Colorado. So we know we really suppressed bear populations in the 20th century, early 20th century, and that was done with traps and guns and poison and basically a societal unappreciation or even hatred in some cases of large carnivores. And so the early 20th century, we tried to wipe out nearly every large carnivore in the lower 48s, and we were pretty good at it. That all started to change in the 1970s, and we know the bear population in Colorado started rebounding from that, same probably in Washington. So the point is the bear population has done well. It has grown. So we're not talking about an endangered species here, but we are talking about a species that we want to minimize our impacts to. And here's what this is basically a picture of Colorado and basically the western third of Colorado. So the mountainous areas, that is bear habitat, and all the red is human development. So there's a lot of it in Colorado, and there's more of it every day. And so you got more bears, more people, and that's what we're here to talk about. So I'm going to talk about a couple different cities where we worked. The first is one that y'all are probably familiar with, Aspen, Colorado. And when you think of Aspen, you probably think of this beautiful valley and this beautiful mountainous area. When I think of Aspen as the garbage pit of the world, inhabited by uncaring, evil, entitled people. Okay, so I'm kind of joking here, but why do I say that? Some of the things that was interesting was how the culture of people in this city, and I say, it's a generalization, but they never really embraced what our research found. They were tentative in how they handled garbage and the garbage issues, and they believed that the bear problem belonged to wildlife managers, and that this was a bear issue, it's not a people issue. And so as a result, there was very weak law enforcement. And that we were there probably working there, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, and that problem still exists today. So this really is a people issue in a lot of ways. And it's complex, but we'll turn our sights now to Durango. Durango's in the southern part of Colorado, the southwest part of Colorado. I like to think of Durango as golden city of all good things, inhabited by caring, loving, smart people. Okay, so why is that? They ended up really embracing the research that we did. The city, after the research program ended a couple years ago, they invested another $600,000 in additional bear-resistant containers, and they were pretty serious with law enforcement. So I want to dive into some of the study now. And just to kind of get everybody up to speed a little bit about what kind of methods we used for this study, we did a whole lot of bear captures. So we captured bears, we put on GPS collars so we could get locations of bears and understand how they move through the environment. We did a lot of what we call DNA mark recapture. This is a technique you use to understand how many bears are on the landscape. I'll go into that here in a little bit. We would visit dens every year. We'd collect a whole lot of information in the dens, so how many cubs they had, the weight, all kinds of things you can learn in dens by handling the bears. We would monitor the natural food. This is a really important component of the story, is what's happening to the natural food. By natural food, I'm talking about the berries and the acorns that are out on the landscape. We would monitor conflict, come up with real standardized ways of understanding how many conflicts were occurring in the cities. And then we would do these garbage experiments that I'm going to talk about. And we did some human dimensions that I won't really talk about much at all. One of the key things in a study like this is finding a good bear biologist. So what is a good bear biologist? First of all, a good bear biologist has to be very, well, it cannot be claustrophobic at all. So the bottom picture is Heather, one of my colleagues, working a bear in a very tight den. So we would climb into these dens every winter. So one, you have to be kind of skinny, and then you can't be claustrophobic. And so those two things make me a very bad bear biologist. And then the third thing is that picture of this kid up in the upper left there. So that sack that kid is smiling about, that's how we attract bears into our what we call hair snare sites. All right, and this is how we understand how many bears are out on the landscape. So that sack is one of the most disgusting things you will ever smell in your life. And so that was a sack of fish, and we put these sacks of fish in a 50-gallon barrel, and we'd pack it as full as we can, and then we'd let it sit for a month out in the hot sun. And the flies would find it, and there'd be maggots all over it, and it would smell like you wouldn't believe. And bears love that. Okay, so that's how we would attract bears into our sites. And so this kid has a smile on his face. That's a good sign of a good bear biologist. When I get near these sacks, I usually vomit. So there you go, strike three. I'm not really a very good bear biologist. All right, last thing I want to say about the team is you just work with smart people. These are great people. These are key people that were involved in the study. A couple of them were my students. Others were working for the state of Colorado. Just a real talented team of people. All right, so I'm gonna go very quickly through some of the things we found in the Aspen study site. And you can think of it as a way of kind of getting started. So it was 5 years of work. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details. I'll tell you one thing. I'm going to say one controversial thing right now. Education does not work. All right. And so there's this notion out there that we can go into a city and we can educate people. All education methods reduce the number of bear-human conflicts. This comes out of a paper and that I took very strong opposition to. This is not true, but it is a common thing that you will hear. How to deter problem black bears? Educate people. I want to send the opposite message, and we've written some work to respond to these notions that we can just educate our way out of this. That is not true. Education is a very important kind of long-term component of becoming a real bear aware and bear safe place, but it does not solve the problem. And we have experimental work where we tried educating people with signs. We saw very little response in how people handled garbage. We did these kind of citywide experiments where we had control and treatment areas, and we did bear aware programs to try to change how humans would handle garbage. And we ended up seeing very little, if any, response from how humans behaved relative to these education campaigns. And that's why I say education does not work. Education, though, is an important thing, but it's a long-term strategy. All right, number two, we did, one of the questions we were really interested in is what are the impacts of these towns on the bear population? This is a really hard question to get at. And we weren't able to quite get there in Aspen, but we were able to kind of take a educated guess through a fairly sophisticated modeling effort. And one of the things the model pointed to was that, hey, these cities can really, or these towns can really be quite a sink for black bears, meaning the population can really be hit hard because of how we handle bears and how we handle the conflict with bears. The last thing I wanted to, that we started getting insight into Aspen was that really attacking the garbage problem and limiting the amount of food resources was going to be much more effective than, say, a program like hazing bears. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about, let's just haze bears out of town, things like that. As long as you have food resources in the town, that's probably not going to be a very effective methodology. So everything from Aspen was pointing to, let's clean up garbage. All right, so I'm going to turn most of my attention to the Durango study site. And this is a map of Durango in the middle there. You see the kind of the very light blue, that's the Durango city center. Now the orange around it is development that's occurring within the county. And this is in 1970. And you can see the development there. This is in the 1990s. And this is today. So just again, showing you, all right, we got a lot of bears. We also got a lot of people. Okay, so this may be somewhat familiar in your neck of the woods as well. This is a map. Again, Durango's in the center, and every red dot represents a trapping location. So this is a location where we put out a trap to catch bears. I'll show you what that looks like. And this went on for 6 years and a total of almost 6,000 trap nights. And so this was, I'm just giving you a feel for the effort we went through. This is a picture of a bear coming out of one of our traps. It's been drugged, so it's kind of woozy as it walks out. We almost had about 1,000 captures of bears. We marked a lot of them, probably handled around 600 or so unique bears. So this is all, there's a lot of data coming out of this program. We focused all of our efforts on collaring animals. You can see a GPS collar on this female, and we only collared female bears. So normally when I say that, I ask the audience, does anybody know why we focus on females. And usually no one gets the answer correctly, but the answer is because, well, the females are the most important. So every female knows that, and really most males know that if they're, true to the question. Anyhow, so we really focus on females because females are the most important to the population. This is just a picture of all the data that has come out of this study. So what you're looking at is Durango is under all those dots, and these are all locations of bears that we have collected, almost a million GPS locations. Each color represents a different bear. The point here is that we have a lot of data, so we can really understand what the bears are doing, how they're moving through space and through time. This is also just a quick summary showing you how we collected information on the vegetation and what the vegetation was doing. Again, we were saying the natural food is a really important piece to understanding bear-human conflict. So we looked at things like gamble oak, serviceberry, pinyon pine, crabapple. All of these are important bear foods, and each year we'd get an index of how much was available kind of within the Durango area. One of the things I really want to point out to you is really pay attention to the year 2012. And what you'll notice is nearly every important plant species was really at a very low index. So this is pointing out a big part of how our system works in Colorado, which is periodically you have these food failure years. And these are the bad years when we have a lot of conflict. Okay, so we experienced one in 2012 during our study. So I'm going to go into some results now. And when I'm talking about resource selection, this is really a fancy word for how are bears moving across the landscape and what can we learn from this. And so this is just a picture of one bear, B25, in 2011. All those green pins are basically where the bear was moving around, and it's being a bear that you would hope bears would be. You can see Durango kind of at the bottom center. The bear is well away from town, and this is during a good food year. So this is what you hope to see. This is the same bear, again, in 2012, during a bad natural food year. All right, so what you see here is it starts off well away from town, but as the summer goes on into fall and the food failure occurs, that bear is moving right into town. And we know why it's moving in there, because there's a lot of food availability in the form of garbage there. Interestingly, same bear, the next year, another good natural food year, what we see is the bear is away from town. All right, so there's an important pattern that these bears most of them don't necessarily want to come into town and stay in town. They don't like it there. They don't like people for the most part. So we'll see these bears go in and out of town depending on how much food is available in the natural environment. So this kind of summarizes all the bear use. The cool colors, the blue colors, indicate very low use. You can see Durango City in the middle. The red is when it's with the hot looking colors means there's a whole lot of use. So during a good natural food year, what you see is not a whole lot of use in the Durango area, but during the bad natural food year, it really flips. All right, so the bears really move into Durango, and this is something we're trying to avoid. All right, I think I'll just skip this. I think you guys got that point. I want to talk about how we understand what is happening to the bear population. This is a really critical component of our study. Remember in Aspen, we built these models saying, I think these towns can act as a real sink for bears, meaning a lot of bears die when they come to town. So we wanted to understand that. We also wanted to understand how food shortages influence this dynamic. The food shortages being natural food shortages that I've been talking about. So we really wanted to understand, quantify the annual abundance of bears, and then investigate how human development impacted the population. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but what we did is you can see this picture of Durango's at the bottom there, but we built this grid, and every grid is like a 4-kilometer square grid. And within that grid, we would put a hair snare in some place in the grid, and we would attract the bears into the hair snares. The hair snares would collect hair from the bear, and we'd use that to get DNA, and then we'd use that DNA to identify individuals. From there, we can build an idea of the population. All right, here's a picture of a hair snare. You can see the barbed wire around this tree, these trees. In the center of that is this stinky bag of rotting fish that attracts the bears into there. They cross under that wire. You get a little hair stuck on there, and you can see a picture of the bear hair on a barb. So we collect that hair, and then we take it into the lab and analyze it. So that's how we start understanding how many bears are out on the landscape. It's real intensive, but it works. Okay, so I won't go into a lot of this analysis, but just trust me, this is pretty sophisticated. There's a lot of mathematics to this, and you need some guy like this to help you analyze the data. This is Jared Laufenberg. Very, well, he kind of looks like a guy from ZZ Top. Anybody, if you know the group, the rock band ZZ Top. Anyway, smart guy. He's really helped us out understanding bear population in Durango. I'll skip this. I'll skip that. Again, a lot of mathematics goes into this, a lot of trying to figure out bear movement relative to the population. Here's the take home I want to really highlight here. And in the red boxes on the left side of the screen, you have the year at the top, 2011, 2012, 13, and 14. And then there's a box, a bigger red box at the top, and it shows two numbers, 203 and then 86. And basically what that is saying is in that area that we sampled with around Durango, in 2012, there was about 203 female bears within the Durango area, okay? Remember, we had a food shortage then. The next year, because of a lot of mortality, that population shrank to 86 females. So this result was pretty stunning. We had no idea that our towns could be such an important sink. And so that is something to keep in mind. And this is something that we, as a field, a wildlife management field or of science, we don't really understand this very well because it takes so much effort to get these numbers. And so this is one of the few studies that has done a pretty good job of really measuring this. So here's again just a graph showing how bear abundance dropped from 2012 to 2013. And you would expect, okay, well, if our bear abundance has dropped, then we'd expect conflicts to drop as well. And that is indeed not the case that we saw. And so what I want to point out is on the right side is that graph, there's a line in orange. And that's probably our most reliable kind of measure of conflict. And you can see the number of conflicts in 2012, around 200. 2013, even though the bear population is almost cut in half, we still have a whole lot of conflict. Here's the point. Getting rid of bears doesn't necessarily solve the conflict issue. This is a really important point because a lot of people will argue that, well, let's just hunt more bears, let's lower the population and we'll lower the conflict. As long as you have garbage, Most research indicates that's going to be there's still going to be conflict. All right, I think I've gone over sort of this result enough. I will point out one thing. I don't know if you can see. Can you see that arrow? Can you guys see that mouse?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, I think I'll just skip this. One of the important points, though, is that what is the cause of mortality, and why is, what is during these bad food years? And so there's several kinds of mortality that are occurring. A lot of it, though, is these bears are getting hit by vehicles, and so they come into town, and then there's real susceptible to being killed by vehicles. But there's also higher harvest rates, and then much higher rates of management removal. So those are managers coming in to remove conflict bears. So those are the primary sources of mortality that are causing these drops in the population. One of the things that I think is important to highlight, and I'm not going to go into any detail here, but one of the things we asked was, given we know our climate is changing, and at least in my neck of the woods, droughts are going to be much more likely, and droughts are often the cause of these food failures. So we are predicting that we're going to see these food failures more often. And so what we're wondering is that, given we don't do much about garbage in these urban environments, how's that going to impact the bear population over a longer time frame? And the story isn't, the modeling we've done is not good. So it's something to consider. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail there. Okay, last thing I wanted to cover fairly quickly was one of the things we really wanted to do was really test out what happens when you really focus on putting out these bear resistant garbage cans. Does that really solve your conflict problem? And so we did an experiment in Durango where we purchased 1,000 bear proof garbage cans, and we gave them out to residents in a very controlled experiment. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. The reason we wanted to do this is because you'll hear this a lot, like, okay, everybody, we got to clean up our garbage. There's not a lot of science behind it. So we wanted to put the science behind that before we went to these cities and said, hey, we recommend you really invest in cleaning up the garbage in your city. So that was the point behind this study. This is just again shows Durango, and it shows the city, and every yellow dot is a conflict. And this is between 2011 and 2016. Point is, bears are coming into Durango a lot. There's a lot of conflict associated with garbage. And so we can look at, and here's just another statistic showing what kinds of conflict. And overwhelmingly, the problem is garbage. So you see that down at the line where it says food, trash, and there's almost 3,000 counts. That's the primary source of conflict within these, at least in Durango, probably most urban centers across the West. You hear a lot about fruit trees and beehives and things like that, or bird feeders, but overwhelmingly, what you really want to focus on is garbage. So what we did is we divided Durango basically into 4 sections. And this isn't all of Durango, it's just a lot of Durango. And so the blue, the light blue, green areas, those are what we call our treatment areas. And then the pink areas are what we call our control areas. And so this was a kind of a well-designed experiment. Now there's flaws with it, but I won't go into those. But point is that this was, as good as we could get in terms of understanding what garbage cans do for conflict. And so in the green, blue areas, the light green areas, every resident within that area was provided a bear-resistant garbage container. And then in the control areas, that we just kept it as is, let them do whatever the city had been doing in the past. And so we talk about these bear projects as this really kind of cool thing, but in reality, a lot of my time, a lot of our technicians' time was collecting data on garbage. It's not really all that romantic, but nonetheless important. And we always hired good people that were enthusiastic, as this young gal smiling about collecting garbage data. So again, we distributed over 1,000 bear-resistant cans in around 2013. These were purchased by the state and by my agency. The cost of about $200,000. And then we monitored trash conflicts twice a week for 4 months, and both areas in the treatment and control areas, and monitored how many conflicts over a course of. We did this before we put out the cans, and then for a couple of years after we put out these cans. So how did we do in terms of getting cans out to people? So we did well. We, through 2014, 2016, we'd estimated 97% of residents in the north treatment and 95% in the south treatment areas all received these garbage cans. So we really covered a lot of the residents. One of the critical things to think about in this experiment was, and I'm going to back up here. Notice the green can that this gal's looking at. There's a couple latches here. One of the things that makes these containers bear resistant is that people have to latch those containers. And so that was a bit of a flaw in our experiment. If we could do it over again, we'd have containers that were better integrated into the garbage collection system where people didn't have to do this, because one of the things we noticed was that a lot of times people didn't latch the containers. And so that became an important thing we had to try to correct. How did we correct it? We corrected it with education. So there you go. I'm already contradicting myself and saying education doesn't work. But we put a big effort into trying to get people to latch their containers. We also followed up with law enforcement in the treatment areas to make sure that people were complying with what we were trying to do. So the enforcement was involved in getting residents to help make sure that they were latching their containers. Really, the point here is we wanted to demonstrate if we really limited garbage, what would happen to conflict. I won't go into a lot of detail here. I will tell you, this is how we would sample. We would get up real early in the morning, and this is what we were looking for. These pictures just demonstrate, like the picture on the right is a picture down a alleyway in Durango. This is what we were looking for. Each one of those places that were tipped over, that counted as a conflict point. Yeah, we don't need to know about the statistical analysis. And I won't go into a lot of detail here. We're kind of digging into weeds that we don't need to, except to say that we saw a pretty big treatment effect, which is an important point. And so what we saw is that this just gives you an idea of difference between the control and the treatment areas. So the pre-treatment period, the control and treatment are real similar, meaning there's similar amount of annual conflict. And then after treatment, one of the things we saw in the treatment area, conflict drops, but we also saw in the control area, conflict really go up. And so this is an important point in that when we implemented this experiment, it's very likely that a lot of the bears would go through our treatment areas right into the control areas. All right, remember back to bears being really smart. Yes, we did see a big difference in control and treatment, but we also know that bears were traveling into the control areas and taking advantage of the available garbage in those areas. This is just some of the pre-treatment data. Again, the kind of the real hot areas show where you have higher conflict, and then the greener areas or the cooler colors are where you have lower treatment. So this or conflict, and this is the pre-treatment data. It shows the control and treatment areas, and this is what it shows after. After we implemented the treatment, so got all the garbage cans out. And we see in the southern area, we see a shifting in the conflict down into the control area. And then we see in the northern area, basically just a decrease in conflict. So one of the things that I will end with here is the notion of compliance. As you guys are exploring this, this idea of using bear-resistant containers to control the garbage, it's a critical thing you're about to embark on. But one of the things that's really important is the people are a part of this, and that you have to have people that are compliant, meaning that use the cans properly. These cans, no matter how automatic they are, there's still ways of using them in ways that make them so that they're not bear resistant. And so what we see is in areas with less compliance, we see the conflict still very high. And we think around 70% compliance is where you really start seeing the most benefit from this kind of effort. So a few take-home messages. What we reported, and this is, these are results probably that we compiled a couple of years ago, is that 50% fewer conflicts in control areas. Again, the compliance is really important. A 60 to 70% compliance rate was really kind of an important measure to get to. At least that's what our data supported. And then the thing that I'm not going to talk about at all, but we have a lot of data to show that people really liked what was going on. They were seeing the drops in conflict, and there was a lot of acceptance to what we were doing. In fact, probably one of the neatest results was that once the study was done, we presented this all to the city. The city was so impressed with what had happened that in all those control areas, remember all those control areas where we didn't provide any garbage bear resistant cans, they invested $600,000 to cover bear resistant garbage cans in the control areas, plus in other areas throughout Durango. We're going back this summer. I'm going to go collect some more data to further measure and collect some data to see how these impacts have, what has happened since the study has stopped, which the study stopped about 3 years ago. What we're hearing is that the city is extremely happy with how conflict has been reduced. And so we want to document that. And I think that's another important point, is that what you're doing today, it'll have short-term benefits, but what we think is happening is it also has really important long-term benefits, so that this conflict will slowly keep going down as bears just figure out, hey, this is not a place to go. There's no food availability. Daniel mentioned it earlier that these bears are really smart. They'll figure this out, but they'll also learn, all right, I'm not really getting much food out of these urban areas, so I won't go into them. That's our hope, and that hopefully that story plays out over the longer term, and we want to try to document that. So I think I'll stop there. with a picture of cubs. Gotta always have a end with bear cub picture. So I'm happy to take questions now. I appreciate your listening. Hope I didn't offend anybody from Aspen, but if I did, I'm sorry. And again, I'm happy to take questions.
Stewart, thank you so much for that informative presentation. And I'll be taking questions from the chat box here and asking them to you. But before I do, I just want to answer some of the questions that are a bit more relevant to the Methow Bear Aware project. One of the things I want to talk about is that the trash cans that we are raising money to purchase are self-latching bear trash cans. And so that does take away some of that compliance issue that Stewart was talking about. But it also means that it's really important that we work with WasteWise Methow to purchase the cans through them. There are, third-party bear-resistant trash cans out there, but if you use WasteWise Methow as your trash pickup service, it's really important that we work through them to get the whole community on this bear-proof trash can program. And so the best way, if you are personally interested in getting a bear-proof or bear-resistant trash bin, is to email Casey at WasteWise Methow and get signed up for that wait list. That is the way that we'll be able to move the whole community forward towards a more bear-friendly place. So I just wanted to address that a little bit. And if anybody has further questions on that, you can address me at daniel@methowconservancy.org, and I'll be happy to answer more questions after the presentation. Stewart, you did a good job of generating questions here in the chat box. And so I do want to have some time to ask those to you. There's a lot of specific questions that are kind of methods based, so maybe we can cover some of those first off. So have you thought of going back to Aspen with the Durango results?
Mm-hmm. We've thought about it. Honestly, it gets me pretty frustrated and a little bit angry because we've been to the city council, we've talked to a lot of people, and there's still resistance to the point where I don't know if you guys know the author Mary Roach. She's a best-selling New York Times best-selling author. She has some really wonderful funny science books. Anyway, she got interested in this human-wildlife conflict question, and she approached me about doing one of her chapters in her new book that's coming out, I think, pretty soon, about this bear issue. And we decided, I was like, yeah, I'll tell you everything you want. She's like, well, can you take me anywhere? And can we go like see bears or anything like that? It's like, yeah, I'll take you to Aspen and you can interview people and you can do, your story based on Aspen. This was a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago now. Anyway, the point is, like within, I was like, okay, well, we met at the airport and then we went to a hotel and I said, okay, I'll get you up at 2 a.m. and we'll go out to Aspen and we'll try to find some bears. Within 5 minutes, I found 2 bears in the middle of downtown Aspen that had broken into garbage cans just full of all the leftover Italian food. And it was just kind of gross because you look at those bears and you go, those bears are going to be euthanized. And this is after years and years of people talking about this and trying to get them to clean up their garbage. They've done a little better, but I don't know. There's a lot of complexity to this, and some of the complexity involves how they collect garbage. So in Aspen, there's 4 or 5 different garbage collectors. It's a competitive, capitalistic sort of system. Versus in Durango, the city ran the garbage collection, and so implementing, this effort to clean up garbage at a scale probably necessary was a lot easier in Durango. And I think that might be some of the resistance there. I think it also has to do with just the culture, how people view things. It's a really complex problem. So yeah, I've thought a lot about that. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, that's great, Stewart. So we're fortunate enough to be working with our primary garbage collector, Wastewise Methow, from the get-go on this project. Would you say that's super important to a successful effort?
Absolutely. That's a huge advantage for you guys. You know, in supporting this effort of getting cans out to the critical residential areas just becomes a lot easier if you got a garbage collector that's willing to work with you.
That's awesome. And Wastewise Methow has been a fantastic partner on this. Do you have any other advice for communities kind of wanting to take their first steps toward reducing bear conflicts?
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of I guess maybe not advice, but a message is to be patient with this. And we don't have good data. I was trying to get at it a little bit, trying to get at like how clean do you have to be before you really have significant impact on solving the problem. And that's something we don't really know very well. But there's probably some kind of threshold where the problem's going to, you know, really get better with just a little more effort. But where that threshold is unknown. So I think you just got to, you know, work through it, trust in the fact that this garbage problem is the primary issue, and that and if you keep working at it, you'll get to a place where it significantly improves. If you're not there, I mean, if the problem isn't really started already, you guys are ahead of the game. You have a real opportunity, I guess is another message, you know, to get ahead of this. And so question comes down is, you know, is the extra cost of these garbage cans, is it worth it? So that's something your community needs to answer.
And that's something we'll definitely be working to answer and address as we move forward with this project. Somebody asks, what caused the food failure in 2012?
Yeah, in 2012 it was drought. The other thing that causes food failures are late spring freezes. So we saw a couple of those in Aspen. And so a late spring freeze will take all the berry crops out, you know, just by freezing the flowers. So that's also part of the equation.
And how early in a given season can you forecast natural food levels?
Yeah, wow, that's we've thought a lot about that. I don't know if we have a very good answer to that. Probably you probably start getting a picture, you know, it's kind of late May, early June, and you know, start having a pretty good idea of whether you're going to have a food failure or not. And so you can, you know, not that we do this formally, but you know, the kind of the local wildlife managers, they know when things are going to be bad generally by kind of early summer. And then, you know, you can kind of try to increase your efforts at getting people to comply with garbage and stuff like that. But gosh, it's a hard thing to kind of get rolling in a month or two. So, you know, the idea that you can forecast a bad food year and then utilize that as a way to help you reduce conflict, I don't buy into that anymore. I mostly buy into just trying to clean up garbage. Kind of, it's a year-round effort.
Good to know. Somebody asks about your Durango study area. How do you account for the difference in conflict between the north and south study areas?
Yeah, that's it's a good question. And there's a lot of complexity to my answer that I'll probably skip just because I didn't take the time to really explain a lot of things with that study. But Part of it is just natural variation, and part of it is probably differences in the residential areas that was inherent in the way, the way Durango was laid out. So I think the North Study area didn't have as many alleyways, if I remember correctly, or maybe it's the opposite. Anyway, there's differences in the town that probably play into this as well.
Interesting. There are a number of questions just about kind of the high conflict areas that exist here in the Methow. And the information I have to speak to that is that Lost River Road and the Wolf Creek Road area are both known as kind of conflict areas. And then another area that's definitely one place where there could be issues in the future is the Twist River Road. So right now, those are kind of the high conflict area. But lots of places in the Methow have black bears, and more growth is reaching out into that wild urban interface. And so there could be more problems in the future if we don't transition to bear-proof cans. Just give me 1 second as lots of questions are coming in here. Is there any research on dog-bear conflicts? Do dogs interfere with bears at all, or haze them away from an area?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I guess my answer is, kind of your run-of-the-mill, or most dogs probably aren't going to be real effective as tools to keep bears out. I mean, they may alert people that, hey, there's a dog or there's a bear coming in, and by barking and things like that. But I will also say there's certain programs that are focused on particular breeds. They're called Karelian bear dogs. And these are dogs that are trained to be used as tools to haze bears out of areas. And they can be pretty effective. And I know, like, a lot of my friends in different states who are wildlife managers, they'll have dog programs. Until you clean up your garbage, dogs are not going to be the answer, is probably the kind of the message I would send. Can they be a tool? Yeah, they could be a tool to help, but they're not going to solve your problem.
Good to know. In terms of transmission of bad behavior from one bear generation to another, is this something that is taught by parents to their children, or is this each individual learning for itself?
Yeah, there's definitely transmission of information from mothers to cubs, and I've studied that a little bit. There's been other studies looking at that, so we know that happens, and that's why I caution or I encourage patience with this, because if you're in the middle of a big problem now, there is going to be a lot of knowledge in the bear world, or the bears in your community about what people are in food, and so that knowledge will stay with individual bears and is passed on to their cubs until the garbage goes away and they start learning the opposite. And so it probably takes some time for that knowledge, if you will, to for the kind of the real bad bears to be taken out of the population, and to stop that transmission of learning. So yeah, it does play a role in this.
Have there been any studies on like backcountry trash issues with backpackers and use of bear cans or bear hangs?
Yeah, most of that work comes out of the national parks. So Yosemite, Yellowstone, Glacier, the Smokies, all these parks they've really pioneered this notion of cleaning up garbage. And that includes, so they went through this process really in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so we've learned a lot, that lesson from them. And one of those efforts is cleaning up garbage in the backcountry. So keeping clean camps and, using the bear barrels and stuff like that. That's real important for backcountry use to reduce negative interactions.
Give me 1 second here. Number of long questions. Are there any seasonal fluctuations between, like in bear conflicts? Are there hot times of year?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's mostly during kind of, once you get towards midsummer, that's when hyperphagia starts kicking in with bears. Basically, hyperphagia is, they're eating all the time, trying to put on fat for the hibernation season. So that's when conflicts will start really going up, is midsummer in through fall. Especially during those years without natural food forage, then that's when you really see it kick in. That's not to say you can't have conflict in the late spring, early summer, but generally, it's kind of the late summer into fall period that's the hardest.
Makes sense. And I think this might be our final question here. I know a number of you have been asking really specific questions about bird feeders and compost. And what I will say is that we're building a landing page for the Methow Bear Aware campaign. And as part of that, we'll do our best job of answering a number of these questions as kind of a frequently asked questions piece. And so in my follow-up email, I will point all of you to that resource so that you guys can get the answers that you deserve while respecting the time of our speaker here tonight. This one though asks, is compost a bear problem that's non-meat? And if so, do you know anything that can reduce that conflict?
Yeah, so I compost a lot too, and I think about this. I don't live in bear country, but I do think about attracting wildlife, and my issue is raccoons. So yeah, I would say it could be an issue. I mean, you put some fresh whatever into a compost heap, you have the potential to attract wildlife. One of the things we do know that works very effectively for things like chicken coops and compost heaps and beehives is electric fencing. So that's something, it's a tool for, I don't know exactly what your community's like, but we do things that we want to keep, I love composting. I think it's an important thing to do. Having beehives is an important thing to do, but there's ways to protect it, and electricity is a great bear deterrent. So a lot of states have programs where you can cost share with the state or something on getting the right kind of fencing. You can anyhow put an electric fence around that compost heap, and that'll usually solve the problem.
That's a great suggestion. And